August 19th, 1944, East Prussia. Inside the cavernous war room of Wehrmacht headquarters, the air was thick with tension and the smell of grease pencils. Map tables were cluttered with pins, scrawled lines, and increasingly desperate calculations. General Oberst Alfred Jodl leaned over the latest intelligence reports pouring in from the collapsing Western Front, his eyes scanning the figures as if searching for a flaw in the arithmetic. The situation was stark. From the beaches of Normandy to the armored spearheads of the U.S. Third Army, the Allied advance now stretched over 400 miles, a distance that no German planner considered sustainable. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to travel these vast distances over bombed-out roads, bridges, and towns, still choking under the debris of earlier Allied bombardments. Every mile added weight to an already fragile supply chain. For tanks and armored vehicles, forward momentum depended entirely on the trucks, the pipelines, and the supply depots keeping them fueled. Without them, even the fastest tanks became immobile steel coffins.
To Jodl and his staff, the mathematics were brutal but clear. Patton's columns were at the very limits of logistical endurance. Just as in Russia, where German advances had outrun their own supply lines in 1941, the Wehrmacht expected history to repeat itself. Fuel depots would run dry, trucks would break down, roads would become clogged, and the armored spearhead would grind to a halt, giving the Germans precious time to regroup and establish defensive positions along the Seine. The generals assumed they knew the outcome. Their experience had taught them that speed without supply was a vulnerability. Blitzkrieg was not merely about tanks and tactics, it was about sustaining them. An armored division consumed roughly 150,000 gallons of fuel per day while on the move. The numbers, they believed, told a story of inevitability. Patton would be forced to pause, limited not by German guns, but by physics and logistics.
What Jodl and his officers did not know, what no German calculations could predict, was that behind Patton's front line, a different kind of war was being waged, one that would bend, twist, and ultimately shatter their understanding of supply, mobility, and operational endurance. Within just a few days, thousands of American trucks would roar eastward along purpose-built highways, defying every expectation, every calculation, and every assumption about the limits of logistics. This operation, soon to be known as the Red Ball Express, would turn supply into a weapon, and, in doing so, change the course of the campaign. Jodl's officers had lived this reality themselves. An armored division consumed roughly 150,000 gallons of fuel per day while on the move. Every mile of advance demanded careful calculation. How much fuel could reach the tanks? How many trucks could make the journey unimpeded? And how quickly supply depots could be replenished? American tank columns were already operating at the very limits of their logistical tether. Any miscalculation, any delay, could freeze the spearhead in its tracks. The calculation was straightforward, brutal, and, in the eyes of the German High Command, mathematically inescapable. Without fuel, even the fastest, most formidable tanks became nothing more than 30-ton steel coffins, immobile and vulnerable.
Germany's generals, veterans of the Lightning War, assumed they knew how this story would end. Just as the Wehrmacht had bogged down outside Moscow in 1941 when its own supply lines failed, so too would the Americans be forced to pause their rapid advance, grind to a halt, and allow the Germans time to regroup, reinforce the Seine line, and perhaps hold until winter. Every calculation, every estimate reinforced the expectation that logistics would serve as the ultimate governor of speed, limiting even the most audacious maneuvers. But what Jodl and his staff did not know, what none of them could imagine, was happening 125 miles behind Patton's front line. There, 5,958 American trucks were already roaring eastward, engines growling, headlights blazing in defiance of every established rule of military movement. Roads that German engineers deemed impassable were being traversed with precision. Convoys stretched like ribbons of steel across the French countryside, moving relentlessly, day and night, in an operation that German military science had no framework to comprehend. 12,500 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations were being delivered every 24 hours along purpose-built one-way highway systems.
It would come to be known as the Red Ball Express, a logistical marvel that transformed the concept of supply into a weapon of war. Within 72 hours, the operation would shatter the German High Command's most deeply held assumptions that there were hard limits to mobility, that supply could only slow an army, that logistics was a limitation rather than a tool of decisive power. The Red Ball Express proved that, with ingenuity, industrial might, and relentless human endurance, an army could push beyond the constraints that once defined warfare. Every truck, every mile, every delivery was part of a larger calculus that the Germans could not anticipate. Each convoy was a demonstration of operational audacity, headlights cutting through the night, trucks moving with mechanical precision, maintenance crews ready to repair or replace vehicles on the fly, and drivers, many of them African American soldiers, facing the dual challenge of war and segregation, keeping the lifeblood of Patton's army flowing without pause.
To the German generals, it must have seemed like an impossibility, an enemy whose supply system operated faster, more efficiently, and more relentlessly than their own. What they saw as inevitable logistical collapse never came. Instead, the Red Ball Express rolled on, defying every expectation and proving that in modern warfare, supply could be as decisive as artillery, tanks, or strategy itself. Within days, the notion that logistics constrained operations was overturned. The Americans had weaponized supply, and the battlefield would never be the same.
The German General Staff's confidence in Patton's imminent paralysis was rooted in bitter, first-hand experience. Blitzkrieg had always depended as much on supply lines as on speed. No matter how fast tanks moved, they could only advance as far as the fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, and supply depots behind them could reach. In the Russian campaign, German armored divisions had surged hundreds of miles beyond their own logistical support, leaving supply echelons stretched thin and vulnerable. Trucks ground to a halt on rutted, mud-choked roads, engines overheated or broke down under the strain, horse-drawn wagons, still constituting nearly 80% of German transport, were hopelessly slow, unable to keep pace with mechanized formations. Railways offered little relief.
Gauge differences meant captured Soviet lines could not immediately support German trains. Every mile of rail required time-consuming conversion. The consequences were devastating. Entire offensives stalled, not because of Soviet firepower or counterattacks, but because fuel and ammunition depots were simply too distant to sustain momentum. Winter often arrived before German tanks could reach their objectives, leaving spearheads stranded and vulnerable.
The generals expected the Americans to encounter the same immutable law of war. Massive mechanized columns operating far from their ports of embarkation, traversing bombed roads and damaged bridges. It seemed inevitable to the Wehrmacht that they would overextend themselves. To the German high command, logistics was the invisible hand that would enforce a pause, a natural limit to Patton's audacity, and an opportunity to regroup along the Seine. The assumption was simple: supply lines would fail, and the speed of the Americans would be their undoing. In July, General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Lützwitz had written with chilling certainty, "The Americans face the same impossibility we faced in Russia. Their machines are their weakness. They will run out of fuel as we did, and then we will strike." German intelligence meticulously tracked every movement of Patton's columns, calculating distances, fuel consumption, and supply needs with ruthless precision. Every road, every destroyed bridge, every congested town was accounted for. They knew exactly how far tanks could move, how many tons of fuel and ammunition would be required, and how quickly those supplies had to reach the front.
A single M4 Sherman tank consumed roughly half a mile per gallon on roads, and even less over bombed terrain or muddy fields. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily. An armored division demanded 1,000. Patton commanded 12 divisions. The arithmetic was unyielding. 12,000 tons of supplies needed each day, transported over 400 miles of bomb-damaged, congested French roads. Every calculation seemed to confirm what the German generals already believed. The Americans were advancing at a pace that could not be sustained. Logistics, not enemy fire, would be their undoing. On August 20th, General Major Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, summed it up bluntly. Even with perfect roads and unlimited trucks, neither of which they possess, the Americans cannot sustain their advance for more than 48 hours. Physical law cannot be defied. The implication was clear: the Allied advance would stall. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and supply bottlenecks would force Patton to pause, allowing the Germans time to regroup along the Seine, reinforce defensive positions, and perhaps hold until the onset of winter.
But German calculations, painstaking and precise as they were, could not account for what was quietly taking shape behind the front lines. While the Wehrmacht predicted collapse, the Americans were preparing an unprecedented solution, a massive, coordinated logistical operation that would defy every expectation, every equation, and every assumption about the limits of supply. Thousands of trucks would roll across purpose-built one-way highways, moving at a pace that seemed impossible. Convoys would run day and night, headlights blazing, carrying fuel, ammunition, and rations in volumes that German planners had deemed unattainable. Within days, this operation, soon to be called the Red Ball Express,
would demonstrate that logistics was not merely a constraint, but a weapon. It would shatter German assumptions about the physical limits of supply and mobility, proving that industrial might, ingenuity, and human endurance could bend, stretch, and ultimately overcome even the most daunting operational challenges. What the Wehrmacht saw as inevitable stagnation would in fact become unstoppable momentum.
2 p.m., August 25, 1944. In a requisitioned chateau near Le Mans, Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayers of the Motor Transport Service faced a room of skeptical staff officers and laid out numbers that refused conventional logic. Traditional supply doctrine was collapsing under Patton's velocity. Railways were too slow, existing convoy systems too congested. Ayers' solution was blunt and radical. "We're going to build a one-way highway from the beaches to the front," he announced. "Every vehicle runs 20 hours out of 24. No stops except to refuel. 12,500 tons minimum per day." The name came from American railroad parlance. A Red Ball train was an express freight run granted absolute priority. The Red Ball Express borrowed that principle and weaponized it. 2 parallel, one-way routes would carry non-stop convoys, headlights blazing through the night, blackout rules suspended, stops forbidden except for fueling. Mobile repair units were staged roughly every 50 miles. The system was deliberately unsentimental. Inefficiency and caution were removed. Redundancy and speed were built in.
In 36 hours, the theory became practice. The roads of France filled with timed waves of GMC, CCKW, deuce and a halves. Maintenance crews rode the columns, and depot managers pre-staged fuel and ammunition at intervals calculated to keep the spearhead moving. What looked like chaos on paper operated with a single, ruthless purpose: keep the flow moving. The Red Ball Express was logistics reduced to a machine, crude, relentless, and devastatingly effective. August 26, 1944. Soldiers of the 39 16th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the famous deuce and a halves. These vehicles were the backbone of the American logistics machine, mass-produced, rugged, and designed to endure abuse that would cripple most European trucks. They were versatile, all-wheel drive, capable of fording rivers, climbing bombed-out roads, and carrying enormous loads over distances that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. Today, the convoy rolled east toward Milan, loaded with 105mm shells to feed the relentless fire of Patton's advancing artillery.
Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually staff the Red Ball Express, roughly 75% were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army. Denied combat roles and equal recognition at home, these men were about to become the vital engine that sustained the Allied advance into Germany. They treated their trucks as partners, naming them with swagger and defiance. Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, Here We Come. Every mile driven was both a military necessity and a statement of resilience and pride. The drivers established their own informal rules to keep the convoys moving. Slower trucks were immediately pulled off the main lanes. Vehicles that broke down were pushed into ditches or stripped for parts to keep the line flowing. Any truck struggling to maintain 20 miles per hour was treated as a hazard and removed. Mechanics rode alongside in the columns, swapping engines or repairing drivetrains on the fly. sometimes under darkness or rain, ensuring that even catastrophic mechanical failures did not halt the movement.
German reconnaissance units were the first to notice the unprecedented scale. Observers perched along the route radioed back in disbelief. Continuous vehicle columns. Headlights visible for 20 kilometers. No blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans have abandoned all precautions. For German officers trained in strict military doctrine, it was pure madness. Conventional wisdom dictated that moving thousands of trucks in long night convoys across enemy territory was suicidal, a perfect target for ambushes or air attacks. Yet the Americans moved with terrifying efficiency, and the Luftwaffe, exhausted and outnumbered, could not intervene. The sight of endless headlights streaming eastward, engines thundering like a rolling river, left German commanders unsettled. They were witnessing a system that seemed to operate outside all known rules of warfare, decentralized, fast, resilient, and almost invulnerable. Every delivery reinforced the realization that the Americans had taken logistics, normally the most mundane and vulnerable part of any army, and transformed it into a weapon of overwhelming strategic power.
August 30th, 1944. General Lieutenant Edgar Feutinger of the 21st Panzer Division observed the convoys personally, craning his neck to take in the seemingly endless procession of trucks crawling eastward. His report to Army Group B was terse but chilling. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. It is not military science, it is an industrial mass. The contrast with German methods could not have been starker. Where the Wehrmacht meticulously conserved resources, calculated every ton of fuel, and restricted movement to minimize risk, the Americans overwhelmed every problem with sheer scale and improvisation. When 1,800 trucks broke down daily, a rate that would have paralyzed a German formation, mobile maintenance crews patched them roadside within minutes or stripped disabled vehicles for spare parts. Engines were swapped in under an hour. Tires changed in a fraction of the time it took German crews to repair a single Panzer. Bridges destroyed by retreating German units were bypassed overnight by engineer teams, who laid temporary spans of steel and timber while columns rolled on. The Red Ball Express itself consumed staggering quantities of fuel, roughly 300,000 gallons per day. Yet, American industry rendered this seemingly extravagant consumption irrelevant. Operation Pluto, the secret network of pipelines beneath the English Channel, delivered a continuous stream of gasoline directly to forward supply dumps spaced every 25 miles along the route. Trucks never waited for fuel. Depots were pre-stocked. Drivers refueled on the move, and the supply lines became a living, pulsing artery of the Army. German aerial reconnaissance never detected the pipelines. The enemy they faced was not merely disciplined or well-organized, it was an industrial juggernaut capable of burning more fuel than the entire German Panzer Corps could hope to muster. Feutinger and his staff watched in stunned silence. The logistical chaos they saw should have been a nightmare. Endless vehicles moving day and night through narrow, bomb-damaged roads, yet it functioned with terrifying efficiency. Each mechanical failure, each destroyed bridge, each obstacle that would have paralyzed a German division was absorbed and neutralized without slowing the advance.
What initially seemed like disorder revealed itself as deliberate, ruthless innovation. The Red Ball Express was no longer a supply operation. It was a weapon in its own right, reshaping the battlefield and rewriting the very rules of war.
The numbers began to speak louder than doctrine. In its first week alone, the Red Ball Express moved 89,939 tons of supplies, an amount that would have overwhelmed any traditional supply system. Convoys of 67 vehicles departed every 5 minutes, a relentless pulse of metal stretching across the French countryside. Nearly 6,000 trucks made 1.5 trips each day, while 5,000 vehicles were on the road at any given moment, engines thundering and headlights cutting through the night. Mechanical attrition, the inevitable breakdowns, collisions, and wear that would have brought a conventional army to its knees, barely slowed the operation. Roadside mechanics repaired engines in minutes, replaced tires on the move, and scavenged parts from disabled vehicles, keeping the convoy system operating at near perfect efficiency. Replacement trucks arrived by ship weekly, ensuring that every loss was immediately offset. Drivers were trained in 2 days, taught to navigate, maintain, and sustain the pace of the operation with astonishing speed. By early September, the Americans were destroying more trucks each week than the Germans had left in France. Yet the system's capacity continued to grow. It was a logistical machine that absorbed losses, adapted on the fly, and accelerated under pressure.
For German officers, the psychological impact was profound and deeply unsettling. Plans, calculations, and assumptions that had guided years of warfare were rendered meaningless in the face of this overwhelming supply engine. The Wehrmacht had faced tanks, artillery, and infantry before, but nothing like this. A force whose power derived not from weapons alone, but from the ability to move men, fuel, and munitions faster than the Germans could react. Field Marshal Walter Model captured the private despair echoing through German headquarters. If these reports are accurate, we face not a stronger army, but a stronger civilization. The sheer scale, efficiency, and audacity of the Red Ball Express forced the Germans to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were no longer fighting merely against soldiers, but against the full industrial might and ingenuity of a nation mobilized for total war. The human cost of the Red Ball Express was immense, yet the spirit of the drivers never wavered. Many drove for 72 hours straight, subsisting on little more than caffeine, cold rations, and sheer determination. Roads were slick with rain, churned to mud by the passage of thousands of heavy trucks. Accidents were frequent. Trucks collided, overturned, or burst into flames, and over 300 drivers were killed in crashes or fires during the operation's first weeks. Yet, despite exhaustion, danger, and relentless pressure, morale remained astonishingly high.
For many African American soldiers, this was more than a supply mission. It was their war. Denied combat roles in a segregated army and facing discrimination at home, they now carried the lifeblood of the army forward: fuel, ammunition,
food, and medical supplies, proving that courage and skill could not be confined by race. Drivers named their trucks with defiant pride: Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, and Hitler, Here We Come. These names were more than slogans. They were declarations of intent, a message that the work of supply could be as decisive as the fight at the front. The endless columns became a psychological weapon in their own right. German soldiers stationed along the route could hear the thrum of engines at night, a constant, unyielding reminder that the Americans were never paused, never waiting, and never vulnerable. Infantry with 3 rifle rounds per man watched as the Americans brought millions of rounds of ammunition forward without pause. German units trained to fear sudden attacks now faced a quieter, more insidious threat: the realization that the enemy's strength could be replenished faster than they could destroy it.
Even German officers could not escape the effect. Reports flowed back to headquarters, describing headlights stretching for miles, convoys moving faster than anticipated, and trucks repaired as quickly as they broke down. Every column that arrived intact undermined German calculations and morale. What had begun as disbelief became dread. Where they expected exhaustion and breakdown, they saw endurance. Where they expected hesitation, they saw initiative and speed. The Red Ball Express was not just delivering supplies, it was delivering a psychological shock, reinforcing the notion that the Americans were fighting not just with men and weapons, but with the full power of a mobilized industrial nation. By turning logistics into a weapon, the drivers of the Red Ball Express proved that supply, often dismissed as mundane or secondary, could determine the tempo, the reach, and ultimately the outcome of modern war. Every mile they drove was a victory, every delivery a small but decisive act that chipped away at German confidence and reshaped the battlefield itself.
The drivers paid an extraordinary price. Many went for 72 hours straight behind the wheel, surviving on little more than caffeine and Benzedrine, with only brief moments to eat cold rations or stretch cramped limbs. Roads were treacherous, slick from rain, gouged by shell craters, and choked with the constant passage of thousands of trucks. Accidents were frequent and often catastrophic. Trucks collided, jackknifed, or erupted into fire from engine failures or fuel leaks. Over 300 drivers lost their lives in crashes and fires, their sacrifice largely invisible to the world outside the columns. Yet, despite exhaustion, danger, and relentless pressure, morale remained astonishingly high. For many African American drivers, this was more than a mission. It was a personal and symbolic battle. Denied combat roles by a segregated army and denied equal rights at home, they now held the lifeline of Patton's army in their hands. Every mile they drove was a defiance of Nazi ideology. Every successful delivery, a statement that courage, skill, and endurance were not determined by race. Drivers named their trucks with bold swagger: Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, Here We Come. These names were not mere slogans. They were acts of resistance and pride, a declaration that they would be the invisible force sustaining victory.
The sound of the convoys became a psychological weapon. German infantry at the front could hear the engines rolling endlessly through the night, a constant mechanical drumbeat, signaling unstoppable momentum.
Columns stretched for miles, a river of trucks feeding an army that seemed impervious to attrition or exhaustion. German soldiers, rationed to 3 rifle rounds per man, watched in disbelief as the Americans delivered millions of rounds, thousands of tons of fuel, and a ceaseless supply of food and medical provisions. Each passing convoy reinforced the sense of inevitability, that the Americans would keep coming, that resistance could be delayed but not halted. Even officers at headquarters struggled to quantify the effect. It was not just the physical supplies that mattered. It was the psychological weight of an enemy who could sustain, replenish, and accelerate at a pace the Wehrmacht could not match. The Red Ball Express had become a weapon of morale as well as logistics. Every mile driven, every load delivered, every convoy that rolled without pause chipped away at German confidence, sowed doubt, and reshaped the battlefield long before tanks or artillery arrived.
The German technical staff went beyond mere observation. They dissected the trucks themselves, trying to understand how a simple supply vehicle could carry the weight of an entire offensive. The GMC CCKW was more than a truck. It was a symbol of American industrial might and ingenuity. 500,000 had been built, all to standardized specifications, allowing parts to be swapped seamlessly in the field. All-wheel drive was standard, enabling trucks to traverse mud, shell-cratered roads, and shallow rivers with ease. Waterproofing allowed deep fording. Engines ran reliably on low-grade fuel. Spare parts were abundant, distributed along the route and stockpiled in depots. Unlike German vehicles, which were painstakingly engineered and difficult to replace, the CCKWs were designed to be used hard, abused, and, when necessary, discarded without hesitation.
For German engineers, logisticians, and even racial theorists, the realization was both technical and existential. A racially segregated logistics corps, men denied combat roles, facing discrimination at home, was outpacing the German war machine in speed, efficiency, and resilience. Every mile they drove, every supply depot they kept running, and every breakdown repaired on the fly challenged not only German calculations, but the very ideology underpinning Nazi assumptions about race and capability. These soldiers were proving that discipline, skill, and determination were more decisive than the flawed doctrines of the enemy. The shock was compounded by scale. Even the most seasoned German officers could not comprehend the redundancy and simplicity of the system. Thousands of trucks moving non-stop, crews trained in days rather than months, supplies delivered with machine-like reliability. Nazi propaganda, which had once celebrated German superiority in every field, simply stopped mentioning the Red Ball Express. It was a problem that could not be spun, excused, or explained, a logistical and moral defeat unfolding in plain sight.
The Red Ball Express had become more than a supply line. It was a rolling testament to industrial power, organizational ingenuity,
and human courage, all delivered by men the Nazis had dismissed and underestimated. In the eyes of the German High Command, the operation was a paradox, a force simultaneously simple and unstoppable, improvised yet relentless, and built on the work of those they had deemed unworthy of frontline service. The Red Ball Express reshaped the battlefield in ways German planners had never anticipated. Bridges the Wehrmacht considered impossible to repair in days were rebuilt in hours. At Mantes, a span calculated by German engineers to take 6 weeks to replace was reconstructed in just 14 hours. Steel girders and timber planks forming a temporary crossing while convoys flowed uninterrupted. Ammunition delivery rates shattered every German projection. At Metz in September, American artillery fired over 100,000 rounds in 24 hours, all made possible by Red Ball convoys. German guns, rationed to 50 shells a day, fell silent under the crushing volume of Allied firepower.
Vehicle attrition reached catastrophic levels by late September. At any given moment, roughly 30% of the trucks were deadlined, sidelined by mechanical failure, accidents, or wear. Tires were consumed at a rate of 10,000 per week. Yet American production never faltered. Replacement trucks arrived by ship weekly. Spare parts were pre-positioned along the route, and repair crews kept the system moving. It was logistics on a scale no European army had ever witnessed. A continuous, self-renewing machine powered by industrial might, ingenuity, and sheer human determination. The effects rippled far beyond the military sphere. French civilians along the Red Ball routes watched the endless columns and, for the first time in years, experienced abundance rather than scarcity. Convoys handed out chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and canned goods, offering small relief amid the ruins of war. German intelligence noted the change in sentiment. Resistance activity surged 400% as civilians saw the Americans not merely as liberators, but as an unstoppable force sustained by machines and men who never stopped.
Every mile of road repaired, every convoy delivered, and every artillery shell fired underscored a simple truth. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was a weapon of industrial power, human courage, and operational genius. German planners, engineers, and soldiers alike were forced to acknowledge it. A logistical phenomenon that could neither be destroyed nor ignored, and one that would determine the tempo of the campaign and ultimately the fate of the Reich.
The Red Ball Express rebuilt bridges that the Wehrmacht had deemed impossible to repair in days. At Mantes, a span German engineers calculated would take 6 weeks to replace, was reconstructed in just 14 hours. Steel girders and timber planks forming a temporary crossing while convoys rolled uninterrupted. Across northern France, bombed-out roads, blown bridges, and craters became mere obstacles to be bypassed or repaired overnight. Ammunition delivery rates shattered every German logistical model. At Metz in September, American artillery fired over 100,000 rounds in just 24 hours, all supplied by the relentless Red Ball convoys. German artillery units, rationed to 50 shells a day, fell silent under the thunder of firepower that arrived faster than they could calculate or counter.
Vehicle attrition reached catastrophic levels by late September. Roughly 30% of trucks were deadlined at any given moment due to mechanical failure, accidents, or sheer exhaustion of parts. Tires were consumed at a rate of 10,000 per week. Yet American production did not flinch. Replacement trucks arrived weekly by ship. Spare parts were stockpiled along the route, and maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the arteries of the advance flowing. It was logistics at industrial scale, a machine of unprecedented efficiency, redundancy, and resilience that no European military had ever conceived.
The impact of the Red Ball Express rippled far beyond mere military metrics. French civilians lining the route witnessed a seemingly endless stream of vehicles bringing not destruction, but relief and abundance. Convoys distributed chocolate, cigarettes, canned food, soap, and other small luxuries, transforming devastated towns into temporary havens. Where the German occupation had imposed scarcity, fear, and deprivation, the Americans brought organization, speed, and a tangible sense of hope. German intelligence reported in stunned detail. French civilians now believe American victory is inevitable. Resistance activity has surged 400%. The supply operation had become as much a psychological weapon as a logistical one. Each convoy not only fed the army, but also bolstered the morale of the liberated population while demoralizing the occupiers.
Every mile driven, every bridge repaired, every ton of ammunition delivered demonstrated a simple but terrifying truth. The Red Ball Express was not just supporting combat operations, it was reshaping the very logic of warfare. By turning supply into a weapon, the Americans forced the Germans to confront a reality in which industrial power, human endurance, and audacious ingenuity outweighed conventional strategy, doctrine, and experience. The battlefield was no longer measured only in guns and tanks. It was measured in the unrelenting pulse of thousands of trucks and the men who drove them.
By early September, the strain of the advancing front began to show. Roads were clogged, fuel depots stretched thin, and maintenance crews were working at the edge of exhaustion. Yet the Americans adapted with the same audacity and speed that had made the Red Ball Express a success from the start. Commanders split the main route into multiple sections, creating intermediate supply depots to shorten hauls and reduce driver fatigue. Convoy rotations were implemented, ensuring that no truck or driver was overworked, while mobile repair teams continued to leapfrog along the highways, patching vehicles in minutes and keeping the flow uninterrupted. Vehicle numbers were doubled and throughput increased. Engineers laid temporary bypasses around destroyed bridges, while planners carefully timed arrivals to prevent congestion along the narrow, bomb-damaged roads. But the Americans did not rely on ground transport alone. Mass aerial resupplies supplemented the convoys, with Douglas C-47 Skytrain transports delivering thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations daily. The Luftwaffe, which had struggled to supply mere hundreds of tons during the Battle of Stalingrad, was powerless against this airborne tide. In a single day, the Americans could move 9 times the weight that had once paralyzed German logistics in Russia.
This was more than a supply operation. It was a new paradigm of warfare. The system was decentralized, redundant, and improvisational. Sergeants, not colonels, often made critical routing and maintenance decisions on the ground. Orders were deliberately loose to encourage initiative. Chaos, normally a threat to armies, was harnessed as an advantage. The Germans could not anticipate where or how the next supply surge would arrive. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, a relentless pulse that carried the momentum of Patton's advance forward with unbroken speed. German officers could only watch in disbelief as every adaptation neutralized what they had assumed would halt the Americans. Each additional depot, each new route, and each airborne delivery made their calculations irrelevant. Where they expected logistical collapse, they saw efficiency. Where they expected hesitation, they saw innovation. The Red Ball Express had evolved into a self-perpetuating weapon. Industrial power, human endurance, and ingenuity merged into a force the Wehrmacht could neither counter nor comprehend.
When the strain finally showed in early September, as the front stretched farther than anyone had anticipated, the Americans adapted again with remarkable speed and ingenuity. The main route was split into multiple sections. Intermediate depots were established to shorten hauls and relieve driver fatigue, and rotations ensured that no truck or driver remained overworked. Vehicle numbers were doubled, and throughput increased, turning what seemed like an insurmountable logistical challenge into a machine of relentless efficiency. Every bridge repaired, every road cleared, and every breakdown fixed was a small victory in a larger, continuous campaign. Ground transport alone was not enough. Mass aerial resupply supplemented the convoys. Douglas C-47 Skytrain transports delivered thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations each day. Where the Luftwaffe had once struggled to supply a mere 300 tons to Stalingrad, the Americans now flew 9 times that amount in a single day, unchallenged by enemy aircraft. It was an operation of unprecedented scale, where industrial might, human endurance, and tactical improvisation merged seamlessly.
This was more than logistics. It was a fundamentally new way of waging war. Decentralized, redundant, and improvisational, the Red Ball Express operated with a level of autonomy that German planners could scarcely comprehend. Sergeants made critical operational decisions that in the Wehrmacht would have required colonels. Orders were intentionally loose to encourage initiative and rapid problem-solving. Chaos, normally a threat to armies, became a weapon in America's favor, allowing the system to absorb disruptions, accidents, or attacks without missing a beat. By October, when railways had been restored and began to assume the bulk of supply work, the Red Ball Express had already delivered extraordinary results. In 82 days, it moved 412,000 tons of supplies, covering an astonishing 222 million ton-miles. It had transformed logistics from a passive necessity into an active weapon, a force multiplier that kept Patton's army moving at unprecedented speed.
The psychological impact on the German command was profound. Every day, the Wehrmacht witnessed supplies arriving faster than they could destroy them, bridges repaired overnight, and artillery firing at a rate they could not match. Field Marshal Walter Model, in his final assessment, put it plainly: "We were not defeated by American tanks or planes. We were defeated by American trucks." The Red Ball Express had proven that industrial power, human ingenuity, and sheer endurance could overcome what had always been considered the immutable limits of warfare, reshaping the battlefield
and redefining modern military operations. The aftermath of the Red Ball Express was nothing short of revolutionary. German military analysts studied the operation obsessively after the war, tracing every route, measuring every ton delivered, and recalculating every time a bridge was rebuilt overnight. It shattered every logistical assumption they had held, proving that speed, endurance, and industrial scale could bend the rules of warfare. Global military thought was rewritten in the process, but the most enduring legacy lay not in charts or reports. It was in the men who powered it.
23,000 drivers, the majority African American soldiers serving in a segregated army, became the lifeblood of the Allied advance. Denied combat roles and equal recognition at home, they were thrust into one of the most grueling assignments of the war, sustaining an army moving faster than any supply system had ever allowed. They drove through rain, mud, and bombed-out roads. They navigated wrecked bridges, craters, and endless columns of vehicles. They faced mechanical failures, vehicle fires, and relentless fatigue. Many drove for 72 hours straight on little more than caffeine and benzodrine. Over 300 lost their lives in accidents or fires, and countless more suffered injuries. Yet morale remained astonishingly high. These men were fighting not only the enemy on the battlefield, but also the prejudice and limitations imposed upon them by their own country. Every mile they covered was a statement of resilience, courage, and undeniable skill.
Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the operation and watched silently as trucks flowed endlessly toward the front. Observing the sheer scale of movement, he remarked quietly, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantrymen." And indeed they were. Every delivery kept Patton's tanks fueled. Every ton of ammunition allowed artillery to pound German positions. Every ration ensured that soldiers at the front could keep moving forward. The Red Ball Express was not just a supply line. It was a force multiplier, a strategic weapon that enabled victory through sheer human endurance and logistical brilliance.
The drivers did not receive medals, and newspapers rarely told their story. Yet night after night, mile after mile, they became a rolling symbol of determination. They named their trucks with defiant humor: Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, Here We Come, signaling both morale and audacity. The endless hum of engines became psychological warfare. German soldiers, hearing the constant roar of trucks, knew the Americans could not be stopped. Their supply lines were invincible, their army inexhaustible, and their momentum unstoppable.
The Red Ball Express carried far more than fuel, ammunition, and rations. It carried hope, momentum, and a demonstration of human ingenuity under pressure. It redefined what was possible in war, proving that industrial might, courage, and improvisation could triumph over doctrine, experience, and even prejudice. Every mile driven, every tire replaced, every bridge repaired was a small victory contributing to the larger triumph. The drivers, unsung and often overlooked, had left an indelible mark on history. They didn't just move trucks, they fueled victory, sustained an army, and changed the very nature of modern warfare. The legacy of the Red Ball Express lives on as a testament to the power of human determination, innovation, and endurance. It was a story of courage under impossible conditions, a demonstration that the collective effort of determined men could overcome obstacles that even seasoned generals believed insurmountable. In the history of World War II, no operation so clearly combined industrial scale, human skill, and audacity to produce a victory that was as inevitable as it was remarkable.